Hi, welcome to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharf's real-world advice for well-intentioned humans. Today's episode, divorce, mortgages, and what should we do with the house? I'm your co-host, Jane Prelinger. Your host is Kate Scharf. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Jane.
Separating and divorcing couples have a lot to think about, and two of the biggest, scariest, and most confusing questions are, where will we each live, and how are we each going to afford it? Of course, those questions spin off lots more questions, and thankfully we're joined today by someone who is well equipped with answers. So I'll introduce her, and then I'll turn things over to Kate. Margie Hofberg is president of the Residential Mortgage Center. She combines superb client relations with comprehensive expertise in the mortgage industry. The founding president of the Maryland Association of Mortgage Professionals, Margie has been a mortgage industry leader for 30 years. With her background in education, she applies her teaching skills every day, guiding her clients through the best mortgage options for any given financial situation and life stage. Her approach is professional, knowledge-based, and empathic. Clients at all levels of income and credit feel comfortable with Margie's practical advice and caring demeanor during a stressful period. As a result, she develops long-term relationships with her clients, and they rely on her as a friend and trusted advisor. In 2005, Margie trained in collaborative practice, also known as collaborative divorce, and has become an expert to whom many attorneys, financials, and mental health professionals turn when their divorcing clients need a mortgage. Welcome, Margie.
Well, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
And I also want to welcome you, Margie. You and I have known each other for a while. We met through our shared work in collaborative divorce. It's probably been about 15 years.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Our regular listeners will be familiar with the ideas around collaborative divorce from a recent episode that we did about it. Those of us who do it feel pretty passionately about it. And if people didn't hear that episode, I encourage them to go back and listen. But you're really a very special kind of mortgage professional in that you really understand the stresses that separating and divorcing folks experience. And I have both, and I have the experience of your, not just your knowledge, but your sensitivity in working with folks who are navigating mortgage and housing related issues during that difficult period in their lives. So at the end of our conversation, we'll come back to sort of the very special things that you bring as a person and things that people might be looking for when they're looking for a mortgage professional as they're going through this process.
Exactly.
But for now, maybe you can share with us sort of the big questions that you typically hear from people when they are getting divorced.
I would be happy to do that. First of all, I just want to say that I've probably seen it all. I've probably done more mortgages for people going through separation and divorce than anyone that I know of in the country. I don't have proof of that, but at least 50% of what I do is working with people going through separation and divorce, and I've been doing that for over 15 years. So that's just a lot of people. So when people first come to me, the things that their biggest questions are, can I afford to keep the house? So many times we start with a 20-minute conversation, and that is the first thing that they want to know. Can I afford to keep the house? And we're going to talk some more about what that means as we go through this program. They want to know, can they buy it from their spouse? Is it buying it? What is it called even when they take over the house? How do we value the house? There's lots of different ways to value the house, and people are confused about what does it mean when they say appraisal or certified market analysis or even Zillow, things like that. They want to know, how do you divide the equity? Like the house has some equity in it. One person needs to get some, one person needs to keep it. But how do you actually think about dividing that? Can they qualify? Many people don't have the same kind of work history that you might if you were just you're not getting divorced. And so how can they qualify for it? And then what are the options? What are the ways that we can make this work?
And are there any options that are specifically, related or available to people that are getting divorced?
Exactly.
That might not get it. That's great. Okay. So let's start to unpack that a little bit, starting with the first questions you mentioned. Can I afford to keep the house? And do I have to, or how could I buy it from my spouse?
So I think we'll first talk about, how do you value the house? Is that,
yeah,
I think
sounds
that's
good.
a good place to start.
Yep.
When a couple decides that one person's going to keep the house, and the other person is going to get their share of the equity, the first thing they have to figure out is how are they going to value the house. So there's lots of different ways it can be done. The traditional way is using an appraisal. It's sort of more standard. People are more used to it. They know what it looks like and what it feels like, but it's not the only way. So first, I am going to talk about appraisals first. If you are going to use an appraisal to value the house, it's really important that if at all possible, you do it through the refinance process. And the reason for that is appraisals are not portable anymore. So if, Kate, you get an appraisal outside of the mortgage process to value the house, I can't use that appraisal for the refinance.
Yeah. Can maybe for folks listening who don't know what an appraisal is as versus another way of getting a value, can you just say what that looks like? Who's an appraiser?
An appraiser is somebody who's licensed to value houses. And there's a very standardized way that they do it. And I think that's why the world is most comfortable with that.
So they come to your house, they walk around, they have a checklist.
They come in your house, they take pictures of the inside and the outside, and then they compare your house to other recent sales. So an appraisal is always historical. They're looking backwards, what has actually closed, and they take usually three comparable properties, and then they plus and minus based on the differences between the houses. And so again, that's a really standard way of doing it. If you're going to use an appraisal, then if at all possible, get started on the mortgage process and use that same appraisal. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the program.
And appraisals cost money, right?
If you do an appraisal outside of the mortgage process, then you're going to end up having to pay for two appraisals, possibly. So people aren't very happy about that. And I can also tell you that the numbers are going to be different because although appraising is sort of the standard way of valuing properties, it is not science. It's not even close to science. And I hope no appraisers are taking offense right now, but it isn't. And so you have a very good chance that it's going to be two different numbers. One person's going to be happy and one person's not when they have the two different numbers.
Okay. So that's an appraisal. And it sounds like you're saying maybe not the best way in your situation, but either way, wait.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Do you want to talk now about other methods for valuing the house?
Yes.
Okay.
So when a couple is going through collaborative or mediation or some kind of interest negotiation, and then they can pick a method for valuing the house. It can be as simple as we agree on this number, which I've seen couples do, to we're going to get a realtor to do a certified market analysis. The advantage of the certified market analysis is that it's free. And frankly, it uses the same data that the appraiser uses. But it's not a standard of a format. And so sometimes people are not as comfortable with it. You will sometimes hear people say, we don't want to do the appraisal. We don't want to value the house using the appraisal for the mortgage because the appraisal for the mortgage is more conservative because the bank is protecting their interest. That is absolutely not true. The appraiser for the mortgage doesn't care. They don't care about coming in high or low or anything. They just are coming up with a value. And so that actually is a myth. It's not true.
So they don't actually have a dog in the fight. So no,
they don't care.
What about a realtor? Maybe our listeners are thinking, I'm sort of thinking, well, if you have a realtor give you their best guess at a market value, they are hoping to represent you in a sale, right? Or in buying something, or both. I mean, do they have an unconscious bias potentially?
It could be unconscious, right? Even the most professional realtor is looking at it in a different way.
Yeah.
And the certified market analysis, the format of it, they can take into account going forward, so what the market is doing going forward, whereas an appraisal can only look at the past. So in an upward trending market, a certified market analysis typically would come in a little bit higher, but there's no it's just so not standard that you can't really make any absolutes on any of it.
Okay. So as I'm listening to you, Margie, talking about, beginning this conversation about valuing the house, I'm thinking about this is happening in a special kind of context, right? We're not talking about an individual or a couple interested in selling their home in order to move together. We're talking about a context in which people may have dueling ideas about what they want that number to look like. If someone is looking to buy someone out, they'd like a lower number. If someone is looking to be bought out, they'd like a higher number. If somebody's looking to stay in the house and struggling to figure out, they may want a lower number, regardless of what it means for their spouse. So you were going to talk to us a little bit about this whole issue of a buyout and what that what that means, or an equity buyout. Maybe you can even sort of define equity. What is equity?
So I think that's really important because the house typically is the largest asset or one of the largest assets. In addition to that, the house has a lot of emotional attachment and meaning. And so when we talk about an equity buyout, we have to separate the emotional part of it and just talk about the numbers. When we help the client evaluate, which again, we're going to talk about later, should they stay in the house or not, then we can start talking about some of the emotions that go along with it. But if we're just right now talking about the numbers, the equity in the house is the difference between the value of the house, whatever way you've decided to value it, and the existing mortgage. And again, it's not just the first mortgage, but also if you have a home equity line, that counts as well. So when we look at an equity buyout, what we're thinking about is that one person's going to keep the house and the other person is going to want their share of that difference, that delta between the value of the house and the existing mortgage. And then we're going to decide how that gets divided. So a lot of people, when they first come to me, say, I need to buy the house from my spouse. Well, if you're on title to the house, then you don't need to buy it in the same way that you would do a purchase because you already own the house. So we consider that a refinance. And an equity buyout is just a subset of a refinance. And that's important because the closing costs, the structure are so much better and easier when it's a refinance instead of a purchase. So just sort of starting there, this is not a purchase, even though you're buying your spouse's equity.
So essentially what you're doing is you're restructuring the loan. You're actually decreasing effectively the equity in the house.
Right.
You're increasing the value of the loan itself in order to generate money.
Right.
That you would then be able to use to give your spouse their share of the value of the house, whatever you've decided that share is.
Exactly. Do you want to talk a little bit about how to come up with that share?
Yes, I think so.
So in an equity buyout, the very simplest way to do it would be, and let's just use some numbers because I think it's easier to sort of picture it. Let's say the house is worth $400,000 and there's a $200,000 mortgage on the house. So clearly there's $200,000 of equity. I could actually do that in my head. Divided by 2 is $100,000. And so if Kate and I were getting divorced, then I would need to give her $300,000. I would need to get a new mortgage for $300,000. I would get the new mortgage would pay off the existing mortgage of $200,000 plus generate $100,000 to give Kate. Once we've decided that that's the equity in the house, that is not the only way for me to give Kate that $100,000. It could be that we have a retirement account. And instead, I'm going to get less of the retirement account and Kate's going to get more of it. And I'm going to get more of the equity and Kate's going to get less. So I don't want everyone to think that you have to divide the house and that's the only way that you can get the other person their money. But if that's how you're doing it, that's how it would work. In an equity buyout, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So that's the simple way, the simplest formula. Value of the house minus the mortgage divided by 2. I would like to add just a couple other, not twists, but different ways to look at the equity buyout that I've seen. Again, I'm not in the room when people are negotiating their separation agreements, but I've seen so many agreements. So I've just seen lots of different ways that people have decided on the equity in the house and who would get, how much money they would get.
Great.
So a little bit more complicated formula would be value of the house minus the existing mortgage, minus the cost to sell. So what does that mean? So if we were going to go sell our house, we would have to pay a realtor, and that would be usually 6%. And depending on what state you're in, you may have to split transfer and recordation taxes. So let's say we're doing this in Maryland, and the transfer and recordation taxes are about 1%. So the seller pays half the transfer and recordation. So that's 7%. 7% of the value of the house would be the cost to sell. Now, we're not selling the house, so why are we even talking about this? Because there's a thought that it's not really fair, that the person who is leaving the house, the leaving spouse, not as a judgment, just leaving the house, is getting out of the cost to sell down the road. So there's a thought that maybe it would be fair if we shared in that cost. I have seen that number be from 0 to 7%. In the state of Maryland. And so that's something that gets negotiated. So the formula for the equity buyout might be value of the house minus the mortgage minus the cost to sell. So clearly, if I'm the one staying in the house, I might say it's only fair that, that we share in that cost because you're getting out of it and you're leaving the house. But you might say, well, you're keeping the house, so you're getting all of the appreciation down the road. So too bad. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's a negotiation. Mm-hmm. The third thing that sometimes you see taken out of the equity, besides the mortgage and the cost to sell, is major repairs. And so if the house needs something like a roof, like I've never seen just painting, but I have seen roof, new HVAC system, all new windows, big items. So if we were going to sell the house, we would have to do that repair. So again, it's not there that you're getting out of having to do that major repair. So I've seen a fair amount of agreements where it's value of the house minus the mortgages, sometimes minus cost to sell, and then minus a major repair. So if we were needing to do a roof, saying it's $12,000, then we would be sharing in that cost. Mm-hmm. But the main thing is that it's a formula. Sometimes couples will just agree on a number. I don't really know how they get to that number, but most of the time I see formulas for equity buyouts.
Formulas that someone else developed, or formulas that are developed by the couple?
I'm sorry. Formulas that are developed by the couple with their attorneys or their mediator.
Okay.
So you've come up with a formula, you've written it up in an agreement, and then it's my job to help get you that money oftentimes. And so that's where the equity buyout mortgage comes in. And so in order to, let's just go back to that example, the first one that I did where the person leaving needed $300,000. So what we would do is we would do a new mortgage for $300,000. We would pay off the existing mortgage of $200,000, and we would give the leaving spouse their $100,000, all as part of this refinance, as part of this new mortgage. Mm-hmm. That's what an equity buyout is.
I've heard you say that it's important to understand the differences and the implications of doing it as an equity buyout versus as cash from some other asset. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. So in the mortgage world, it's very interesting. A cash out refinance, a regular cash out refinance, costs much more. There's price hits for a cash out refinance than for a rate and term refinance. Equity buyout is an exception. So if all the proceeds from the refinance go towards paying off the existing mortgage, paying the leaving spouse, closing costs, then it's considered an equity buyout and it's priced as a rate and term refinance rather than as a cash out refinance. That can be a difference of 0.25% in the interest rate. And so let me give you an example of how this could work. So let's just say my parents lent us $10,000 when we bought this house, and we had always agreed that we were going to pay them back when we sold the house, but they didn't need the money before then. So now we're getting divorced and we need to do this. I'm going to keep the house, but we still need to pay my parents $10,000. So we could go back to that example where we had the mortgage of $300,000 to do the equity buyout, but now we also need an additional $10,000 to pay my parents. If we did a loan of $310,000, again, going back to that example, and had $100,000 going to the leaving spouse and $10,000 going towards my parents, that's a cash out refinance. And that's going to be priced higher.
In other words, cash is coming out of that interaction to go to something unrelated to this home itself.
So instead, if the couple is in a situation where there's still some trust, then we could say that we're going to give the leaving spouse $110,000, and then in a separate place in the agreement, the leaving spouse is going to pay back the parents $10,000. So there's ways that you can work it so that it all goes to the leaving spouse, but then it goes someplace else later, and that would still be considered an equity buyout. Another example would be if, let's just say we also have $25,000 of joint debt, and we've decided that part of the proceeds of the refinance need to go towards paying off that joint debt. We're okay with that. And that, again, in that same example, we would want to do $125,000 going to the leaving spouse, and then they're responsible for paying off the joint debt. Obviously, you can only do that if there's some trust still with the couple.
And I've worked with couples where part of that joint debt is money they've spent on the process of getting divorced.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, well, and that happens a lot. And so then it could work, right?
So there is an advantage to doing it in this way versus some other way in terms of the cost of the transaction.
And again, I've had many clients come to me after they've been told if they're doing a refinance and taking cash out to give to the leaving spouse, that it's a cash out refinance and that the rate was much higher. And then their attorney refers them to me like, that's not what the other person told me. Are you sure? And of course it's right. So that's why it's important. One of the reasons why it's important to work with somebody if you're doing a divorce that at least has had some experience with working with people going through divorce.
Yeah, it's such an important point you're making, that there is just stuff that you know,
right?
Because you're a mortgage professional and because you work with folks who are getting separated and divorced, that is important to know that you wouldn't know to ask about.
Exactly.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know.
Totally.
Yeah. That's always a dangerous place to be. So is this a good time to talk about mortgages? I think that the M word, I certainly remember how anxious it made me when I, was facing this issue as a newly divorced person for a lot of reasons. I was not the earner. I didn't understand our finances, and I didn't have a work history of really much.
Right.
So there's a lot there. Do you want to start talking about that a bit?
Yeah, I think let's first start off by addressing the anxiety that comes with having to get a mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
So I would highly recommend to your listeners that the first thing they do is talk to a mortgage professional, because a lot of the anxiety comes from the unknown. So I have so many people that I've talked to for 20 minutes that are just in the beginning of the process. They are not ready to get a mortgage yet. They're nowhere close to getting an agreement, but they just need some reassurance that what the numbers would look like if they were to keep the house or buy something else, but most of the time it's to keep the house, and whether they would qualify. And I can't tell you how many times I get off the phone and the person says to me, "Thank you. I feel so much better. Now I can see what this would look like, or that I can qualify, or that I can't qualify, or what I need to do to be able to qualify." And so I would say that the anxiety comes from not knowing, and don't put it off. Get some information at least so that you can at least push that anxiety away.
That's a really important point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but in terms of qualifying, we look at debt to income ratio, and I call it hurdle underwriting. If you can't qualify, if you can't meet those debt to income ratio guidelines, we can't help you. But if we start early enough with you in the process, maybe we can figure out a way to help you with your debt to income ratios. So some examples are using support as qualifying income for a mortgage. We're going to talk about that. There's some very, very specific things that you need to know. And the second is a lot of, as Kate used in her example of herself, a lot of clients have been out of the workforce or partly in the workforce and now are returning. So I'm going to start with that. So if you have been working at all, then and you get a job that goes from being a part-time job, for example, to a full-time job, as long as you have a work history, then we only need 30 days of pay stubs. You only have to be at the job for a month. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people that haven't been working at all. And so if you haven't been working at all, then you need to be at a job for 6 months before we can use that income. So again, in planning on when this refinance could occur, that certainly has to be taken into consideration. But it is only 6 months. It's not more than that. So at least that's helpful to know.
Mm-hmm.
But we also see a lot of people that were working at their own businesses, sort of in a part-time thing, and not making very much money at it because there was somebody else earning more money and being able to carry the expenses of the household. So they're considered self-employed if they're doing their own thing. And for self-employed borrowers, unfortunately, we have to have a year of a tax return before we can use that income. And so that's going to be more than a year because you need time to get your tax return ready. So if that's your source of income and you're saying, well, I'm going to grow it, well, that's going to be harder to use that income for qualifying. There's going to be more roadblocks in using that income. For people that are hourly, those are like my nurses, technicians, people like that. We look at your income over a W-2, so a year plus the year to date. So now it's March, we would look at 2019 W-2 and then the first couple months of 2020, and we average that income. And again, that's important to know because, again, a lot of these people are not working full-time, but their plan is to ramp up their hours. They got to ramp them up sooner rather than later if we're going to be able to average their income over that period of time. So those are the typical situations that I run into. And so now do you want to talk about using support?
Yes, I think
Okay.
that'd be very helpful.
I'm going to do a kind of a mini version of using support as qualifying income from a mortgage, just to have sort of hit the highlights and not go into too much detail.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. But let's start by talking for people who might not know about what we really mean by support.
So many people or some people get child support or spousal support or alimony.
Mm-hmm.
Spousal support, alimony is the same thing, but it's just people call it different words.
This is money that you're negotiating the amount of it. So you may or may not know what those numbers are going to look like for how long at the time that you have your first conversation with your mortgage professional.
Absolutely. And that's the important thing, is for your mortgage professional to help you figure out how much alimony do you need, and to give you the information on what we need, what documentation we need to be able to use it as qualifying income for a mortgage, so that you can be knowing going into these negotiations what it is that you need to make it work.
Right. And that's so helpful, because assuming that you're working, with someone who wants to figure out how to make this happen, it's better, if you're buying somebody out, they want you to be able to do it.
Right.
And if you're in a collaborative setting, everybody wants everybody to have an outcome that they can live with. It means that you can bring these factors to the table in this process of making decisions about how much of the package relates to support and how much of it relates to the value that you attribute to somebody's share of the house and all
Absolutely.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
I mean, what's the point of negotiating an agreement that the person can't carry out in the end?
Right.
So to use support as qualifying income for a mortgage, there's three parts. The first is you have to have a signed agreement. The second is that you have to have a history of receiving the support. And the third is that the support has to continue for at least 3 years after application. So let's do part one.
Mm-hmm.
So for the signed agreement, the important part is it doesn't need to be notarized or anything like that anymore, but it just has to be a signed agreement, and it needs to say how much. So that's what the underwriter is going to look to figure out whether you qualify. They're going to look at the agreement to see how much support you're supposed to be getting and for how long. It's important that that it's a number as opposed to a percentage. So let's just say that I'm leaving my spouse. My spouse makes a lot of their income in commission. So they get a base salary and then they get commission. And so we've decided that I'm going to get $3,000 a month of child support. And then for alimony, I'm going to get a percentage of his commission. I can't use that for qualifying purposes. So I can use the $3,000, but I can't use the percentage. So again, how the agreement is written is super important on whether or not we can use that income for qualifying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, again, why you need to get the mortgage professional in early.
Okay.
So the second thing is that you need a 6-month history of receiving the support. That is super important. It needs to come from an account just in the person who's paying its name, and into an account just in the person who's receiving it. So a lot of times, again, let's say it's Kate and I getting divorced. Kate, you keep the M&T account. I'll keep the BB&T account. We don't change the names on it. And so it just looks like I'm just transferring money into Kate's account. And I'm on both accounts. And so how is that support?
Mm-hmm.
Even though in reality, Kate's only using that account and I'm only using this account.
It looks like we're just still married.
It looks like we're still married.
Yeah.
So the sooner that you can get your own account, each one of you, so that we can start building a history of the money going from an account just in one person's name into an account just into the other person's name, is really helpful, because you can build the history of support pre-agreement.
Yeah, this is important because, I'm not a mortgage person. I'm not a numbers person. I'm not an attorney, but I'm thinking about these conversations. And technically, anyway, under the law, while people are married, everything is marital anyway.
Right.
So you're not really putting yourself at any jeopardy by opening an account and having some of your spouse's income go there directly, and you writing the mortgage check for a house that you still co-own out of yourself. It doesn't actually set any particular precedent, but it allows you to play with ideas that would otherwise be shut down to you.
Exactly. And so what we see a lot of is just pretty much the situation you've described. So let's say I'm the larger wage earner and I'm going to be the one giving Kate support. But right now I'm not putting any money into her account because I'm paying all the bills. So I don't need to give her. I give her $1,000 a month for stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, if we wanted to build that history of support pre-agreement, instead, why don't I give you $3,000 a month $1,000 for your expenses and you pay the mortgage, which is $2,000 a month. It kind of seems silly. Like, what's the difference? But it works. It definitely works to do that. And that is the biggest stumbling block, is that people don't separate their accounts to building that history. The other thing that's really important is to make that number consistent. So again, let's just say I'm giving Kate $3,000 a month. And then in the end, we decide that support is $3,500. The underwriter is only going to use $3,000. So whatever the history is what they're going to use, as long as it's lower than the number that we end up with. So they're not going to use the higher of the numbers. But what I was getting at is that it's important that every month I give Kate $3,000. Let's just say there's a month where I paid for something that Kate was supposed to pay for, and so that was $500. So Kate, this month I'm only going to give you $2,500 because we've agreed that—
Sure. Makes sense.
Don't do that. Because now I don't have a history of $3,000 a month.
Right. So better for you to pay me $3,000 and I'll write you a check for $5,000.
Exactly. So really important that it's from one account into another person's account and that it's consistent.
Right. And then we're really talking about a strategy for qualification. What you end up doing over time may look different, right?
Absolutely. This is just for mortgages. That's all I care about.
Okay, great. I just wanted to loop back for a second to your explanation of the signed agreement. It made me wonder whether you're saying they need a signed settlement agreement or they need a signed agreement on this in particular, because sometimes people will sort of agree on things in chunks. There might be outstanding issues related to assets, but they've been agreed on support. Does the mortgage company need to see an entire agreement?
So they want to see an entire agreement. They don't know necessarily what an entire agreement looks like, but the two questions that have to be answered is the house and support. So they're going to want to see those two things addressed. The fact that the retirement assets weren't addressed, probably they wouldn't even notice. So you could have a partial agreement, but it needs to look like a separation agreement, a settlement agreement, and it needs to at least address those two questions.
Okay. So I guess the question I have is, what is the role of other assets in qualifying for a mortgage? Say I have X amount of support, but I have these other investments. Is that relevant in the qualifying process?
Not really. I mean, in some very specific situations, but in general, not so much.
Interesting.
But I want to just backtrack on that a little bit. Because the house is one of your biggest assets, usually you don't want to do a partial agreement on the house because then you're giving up the ability to trade assets, which might make more sense for your situation. And I'm just going to really make it very simple. But again, let's go back to that example of a $300,000 mortgage giving Kate $100,000 of her equity buyout. Well, maybe it would have been better for me to just do a $200,000 mortgage and given Kate more of the retirement assets. But if I close this deal, then I've closed down that other option being available to us as a couple to decide what to do. So I would say that in almost all cases, I'm working with a full agreement.
Great. That's really important for people to be thinking about.
And then the third part is that the support has to continue for at least 3 years after application. And it has to be 3 years. It must be 36 months. It cannot be 35 months. I had one recently where we started the application that month and the support started that same month. And the underwriter said, nope, you need one more month because it only continues for 35 months after application, which was true.
Okay. So the agreement needs to stipulate that it will be a full 3 years before anybody can talk about a modification of support.
No, it just needs to just say 3 years.
It just needs to say 3 years. The reason I'm asking is because, without getting into the weeds too much, the bar for, depending on how the support is structured, if it's child support versus alimony, the capacity to modify, there are different bars for that. So I just don't know how people—
It's very interesting. It's a really good question. And I don't think underwriters really know how to handle it. So they just go by what the agreement says and they don't worry about the capacity to modify.
Got it.
Because if you think about it, you could lose your job. Anything could happen for any borrower. So at some point, they just have to say, here's what I've got. That's what I'm going to use. And the fact that it can be modified or not, I just can't worry about that. Right. So the importance of that 3 years, I can't emphasize enough. We will look at the 3 years. So for example, let's say I'm giving Kate $3,000 in year 1, $2,000 in year 2, $1,000 in year 3. I think you all can guess I'm going to use $1,000 as for qualifying income. So again, there's something where a mortgage professional can help you. I had that situation, and the couple had decided it was very important that one of them stayed in the house, in this case, the wife for the kids. She didn't qualify on $1,000 a month support, but she did qualify on $1,500 a month. So because it was a collaborative case, we were able to redo the numbers and do $3,000 in year 1, $1,500 in year 2, and $1,500 in year 3. So, and then the one where we had only 35 months left to go, again, this was a mediation. And so what they did is they added another month of support and then just traded off an asset so that the numbers turned out to be equal. But you don't want to find yourself in that position. So remember, you need the 3 years going forward and the 6-month history. If you're not building the history pre-agreement, then the minimum you need is 42 months. And you're really putting your client in a very tough position if it's only 42 months, because we'd have to time it exactly right. And what are the chances that it's going to be exactly right? So if the client needs, if you need support for qualifying income for a mortgage, having it to be like 4 years is super helpful.
I'm just curious, are banks looking at these numbers as pre or post-tax numbers?
That was actually the next thing I was going to talk about. Yay. So the other thing that's interesting about support is because if the support is child support is has never been taxed. And so for child support, you can always gross it up 125%. So what that means is that I'm giving Kate $1,000 a month, but for qualifying purposes, it's $1,250. So the support has a lot more power in terms of qualifying because it's not taxed. So that's just a guideline that we can gross up 125% any non-taxable income. So if the alimony or spousal support is post the tax law changes, then that also can be grossed up.
Okay. And say something about the tax law changes, because folks may not know when that happened and what that means.
It started in the end. So beginning in 2019, any agreements that were written after beginning in January of 2019, spousal support or alimony that we used to call it is also not taxable.
To the receiver.
To the receiver, right.
Yeah. So that's changed.
Yes.
And it's created a lot of complications. But the main thing is to know about that.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Got it. Are there ever times that you recommend to people that they actually not either buy the house that they live in or buy a new house at the point that they're separating?
So it's not my job to recommend, but it's my job to give them information and help them think about things and ask them questions. And there's times when I'm working with a client that it's clear that yes, I can get them to qualify, but we qualify you for way more than you can afford. And if they keep the house, they're going to not have money to do anything else. So my job, I'm not a financial advisor, but my job is to give them the information and then to talk to them to just ask them questions. What does it mean to you to keep the house? Are you willing to sacrifice being able to go out to dinner, buying a new shirt, taking your kids to sporting events for the house? And in some cases, maybe they are. But I think it's important that they recognize what the numbers really are. I would say maybe it's really not my place, but I do give advice to people about buying. Buying a house costs a lot of money. There's the closing costs and the moving and all lots of expenses, and then selling a house is a huge expense. We already talked about that. The costs to sell. Remember that number, 7%. So if you buy the wrong house, you've made a huge mistake because you've paid now to buy a house and you're going to have to sell the house. So if you're not sure about what your life's going to look like, where you want to live, what's going to be happening, you're going through a lot of emotional changes, things to think about, it's a little overwhelming, then I would always say, then just stay. Refinance. The cost of a refinance in most of the areas, at least in the DC metro area, is about $3,000, maybe $4,000. That's not a big mistake. $50,000 is a big mistake.
And it's probably worth saying, it may be obvious to listeners, but I'll just sort of say it anyway, that you may be working with both with a couple.
Yes.
So there are many, many issues. So it may be a question of staying in a marital home versus selling. It may for one person, it may be for the other a question of renting versus buying.
Yes.
It may be for the couple. Can we afford to keep this in the family for the children? I mean, there are
lots of questions.
Lots of questions, yeah.
But I have especially told people, the person that's leaving the house, when they come to me and they're thinking about buying, are they ready?
Mm-hmm.
Are they really emotionally ready to make a commitment to buying a house, or should they rent for a little while? Because a lot of people have sort of a thought that I'm just wasting money, I'm throwing money away by renting.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's the right decision if you don't know where you want to be or what you want your life to look like.
Yeah, or if you're just so overwhelmed you can't think clearly.
Yeah.
Well, this brings us to what I think is a really important part of this conversation, sort of the last chunk of it, which is the role of the mortgage professional for people who are going through this process. I was sort of thinking maybe we could talk about the role of a mortgage professional generally. Sort of what is a mortgage professional and what can they do for you? And then what's different about a mortgage professional from, just walking into a bank and getting a mortgage, for example. And then maybe after that, talk about the kind of work that you do and what's so special about it.
Okay. So the nicest part about a mortgage professional, particularly when you're going through a divorce, is that we can't charge an hourly fee. So we have to give our time for free. It's not because we're nice, although we are, but we are not allowed to charge an hourly fee. So I spend a tremendous amount of time just talking to people and giving them information. Enough people come back to do their mortgages that it all works out in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fine. And I encourage people to continue to use me because it's free.
Mm-hmm.
You might as well take advantage of that.
So you're paid by?
We're paid by the lender once the loan closes. So, and again, I don't ever want somebody to feel bad that they keep asking me a lot of questions, because enough people come back to do their mortgage that I have made a decision as a professional, this is how I want to run my business.
So
and
it's
it
built
works.
Into your philosophy.
Absolutely. And into my business model, frankly. And it works. Like it just works. There's enough people that come back that I can make a good living and still help a lot of people by giving out free information.
Yeah. Right.
So I would highly recommend that people talk to a mortgage professional. And you want to find somebody that is a good match for you, both in terms of personality as well as knowledge. Another thing a mortgage professional can do is help you come up with creative options. So there are some new mortgage products out there that a lot of people don't even know about when they're thinking about getting divorced. So for example, there's a new product, a new underwriting guideline where we can impute an income off of a retirement asset. So you don't actually have to get the income. We don't have to show a history of it. We don't have to show it going forward, anything like that. But it's a made up number, but there's a formula that we use.
Can you just say a little bit about what that word mean? What does it mean to impute income?
To calculate an income stream that you're not actually getting.
So act as though
that
is money that is part of an income.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it's really helpful because we have a lot of people now that are getting divorced. We're calling it the graying divorce.
Mm-hmm. Older people, which never expected to have to buy another house. Mm-hmm.
So they weren't thinking about building up some kind of income flow because they weren't thinking about buying another house. Many of us are retiring without the old-fashioned pension.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we have large retirement assets, 401ks and IRAs. So if you're getting divorced and you've got $2 million in your 401k and you're getting Social Security, you're thinking, well, of course I can buy another house. I've got $2 million in my 401k.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? Until this new underwriting guideline came out, I couldn't qualify you for a mortgage. I could only use your Social Security, which probably wasn't going to be enough to qualify for any kind of mortgage. So now I can impute an income, so make up, using a formula, an income off of that $2 million of retirement assets, and that's about $4,000 a month of imputed income that I can now add to your Social Security, and now you can qualify to buy something.
Mm-hmm.
So having some of these creative mortgage options, your attorney doesn't know about that. Mm-hmm. That's not their job.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not even thinking that you're going to be able to buy something. They're saying to you, you're going to need to rent. Sorry, you're not going to qualify.
And they might not know, all the creative options for structuring support that you just mentioned.
Exactly.
Either. Yeah.
So there's products out there. There's creative ways to structure support that a good mortgage professional, even the one that isn't working with people getting divorced, would be able to help you with. So going to a mortgage person, again, earlier in the process than you would think about to help you figure out how you can do it can be really, really helpful. And then, of course, a mortgage person can, as you just said, can help you figure out support. And I can't tell you how many times we've gone back and forth. I just had a call yesterday with 2 attorneys where they wanted to know how much support does this person need in order to be able to qualify to do what they're trying to negotiate. So I could have that call with the attorney, but most of the time, frankly, I'm having that call with the client and then they're reporting back to the attorney.
All of that is incredibly important. You're saying that as a profession, you have something important to bring to the table that you won't get anywhere else.
Correct.
And that it's important also that they consult with you early.
Right.
And maybe even before they have any conversations, to deal with kind of their, what the mystery, sort of to demystify things so they can feel less anxious. And then early so they haven't shut down any options for how to structure their agreement. I've been in this field long enough to know that not all, even good mortgage professionals, they're not created equal, and that you have some experience that's really different and special, that you really have worked with a lot of separating and divorcing couples. And so it's not only that you understand these special products and special procedures and requirements, but that you understand a lot about the experience itself and are able to work in a way that's very sensitive to the state of mind of people. For example, that as you mentioned at the top of the show, that equity includes not just a number value, but an emotional value. And that while you can't tell somebody what that number equals, you can certainly work from a place of understanding that it's not irrational to attribute a value to a house that doesn't have anything to do with what the market would indicate. Can you share a little bit about sort of why that is important and what that understanding changes about the way you work?
Yes. Working with people going through separation and divorce is different than working with somebody who's just buying a house. There's so many more emotional pieces to it. So part of it is, as we've talked about earlier, just the knowledge from the mortgage side, the products, how you structure support, all of that sort of institutional underwriting guideline, practical thing. But then the second part of it is learning how to work with people that are going through a really emotional time. We get our clients, they're not their best self. Mm-hmm. So that's just the beginning, is to understand that we're working with people that are not in their best place. And so for me personally, I've done a ton of trainings from people like Kate, the mental health professionals, on how to listen, how to reframe, how to hear somebody. And I think that has probably helped me more than anything else, not only in being a good mortgage professional and working with people going through separation and divorce, but frankly, just being a good person, just a good friend, a good wife, a good mother, learning how to work with people that are not in their best place. And I think that those soft skills have served me so well. And I can say that I'm much better now at doing this work than I was when I first started because of taking all of these trainings. And I think that it's very, very important, because when you're having these kind of conversations with people that are so important, the house is such an important piece of to people, not only because it represents their marriage, but it's the place where their kids grow up. It's where their network is of support, that you need to help them make decisions in a way that's different than, I just want to buy a new house.
Mm-hmm. For the person who is not staying in the marital home, there may be a sort of feeling, I need to buy something that will replicate the kid's experience of being in the marital home. Right. And there can be a kind of drive to purchase quickly or purchase something bigger, so that then you have the matter of sort of figuring out what the underlying concerns are there and asking questions that get people to be reflective.
Absolutely. It's not right. It's not just them coming to you saying, this is what I want to do. It's you helping them figure out, should you do that? Is that the best thing for you? And part of it is just doing the numbers, right? That's important part of it. But the other part is being a good listener. Asking curious questions.
Building a relationship.
And so I think that my my background in education has served me well. I was trained to be a teacher. Clients a lot of times will come to me and say, I don't understand, especially the person who was less financially savvy. I don't understand all of this. And they sometimes are afraid of it. But I think that also my skill set of being able to break things down into smaller pieces so that people can understand it has also helped a lot.
And you're patient and non-judgmental. Both
Yes,
are important. Yeah.
I actually think to that, it's kind of funny. Like, I think being older is actually a good quality in working with people going through separation and divorce, because once you reach a certain age, you've had enough experiences where life has knocked you around a little bit, or things haven't worked out quite the way you expected them to, and you've had enough experiences to become less judgmental. So I do think actually that the graying hair thing is actually a really good benefit.
To be less judgmental and also to have a kind of longer view, like some perspective that while things may feel kind of, big and overwhelming and very, very important, that people are resilient. So even if you don't necessarily say that, you have that faith and it helps you. Yeah.
Right. Because we've all, after you've reached a certain age, you've had those times when you didn't feel so great, but you survived. And maybe even got better because of it.
You told me a story just earlier today when we were getting set up. I wonder if you would mind repeating. It was a lovely story about an experience you had with a client.
So one of the joys of the work that I do is when people come back several years later, either because now they're ready to buy or they want to refinance, and I can see them now at a different point in their life than during the very stressful part of getting divorced. So I had one client who went through a very difficult divorce. The house almost went into foreclosure. It was really sad. She also wanted to have a baby. And so she decided she was going to have the baby on her own. But then she met the love of her life, and they came in together, and she was pregnant, and she was going to be buying a house. And they got married, and watching him look at her and how he adored her, like, that was just so cool. And now, 2 years later, well, now it's 18 months later, today she sent me pictures of the baby, and they're thinking about refinancing. So, like, to see her at her worst, at the lowest point in her life, and now to see her with this baby and this adoring husband, like, that's the fun part of what I do.
Yeah, and you were an important part of that.
I feel like I
that
was.
Experience, that transformation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great.
Margie, this is sort of revelatory for those of us who really had not imagined a mortgage broker to be a you. It's just really interesting. Kate, I remember a couple episodes back, we were talking about how to make a match with a divorce lawyer, right? You want somebody you feel you can relate to as a person, somebody you have a good chemistry with, you trust and think will understand you and actually has your back. And I'm learning from Margie that it sounds like that's really quite important with a mortgage professional as well, if you are lucky enough to find that.
Right. I think that's right. That you want somebody with the experience, the depth and breadth of knowledge that you need them to have, including in separation and divorce, but that you also can feel gets you. Do you have any suggestions, Margie, for people who are getting divorced and looking for a mortgage professional who can find the right kind of person?
So I would say that trust your team. So if you have a team of professionals that you're working with, your attorney, maybe a mental health professional, either as a therapist or as a coach, mediator, a financial advisor. Many people that do this work do a lot of it. Well, of course, the attorneys, but the mental health people and the financial advisors, there's hopefully a chance that they know someone that also specializes in this and working with people going through separation and divorce, and they can help point you in the right direction.
And I imagine that you would support people in talking to more than one person if they need to, especially since they're not paying to do it.
Yeah, it needs to be a good fit. But I think yes, absolutely talk to more than one person if you need to. Find someone, right, that fits you and your personality and has the knowledge base.
Great. Well, thank you, Margie. I think you've given us all some really important and also some reassuring information, including, I think letting us know that there are people like you in the world and that anyone who's going through this difficult, painful process deserves to have everyone who's in their team, everyone who's on their,
right.
In the world of people helping them should feel like someone they want to know, someone that they want, as Jane says, that feels like that person understands them and has their back. So I think you've let us peek into a new world of possibility. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here today.
Thank you so much, Margie. Lots of valuable information, and I wish I had known you some years in the past. Kate, where can people find out more info about Margie?
Oh, sure. We're going to put Margie's contact information and a link to her website, which has a lot of great information, including wonderful frequently asked questions page for divorcing folks who have questions about mortgages. We'll put them along with our show notes on our website, divorceonplanetearth.com, so people can check it out there.
Well, thanks for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharf's real-world advice for well-intentioned humans. We'll be on hiatus in April, but starting back up in May with an episode all about prenuptial agreements. If you'd like to know right away when we have a new episode, we invite you to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter or Facebook, where we are at Divorce for Humans. That's Divorce, the number 4, Humans. You can also listen on Kate's blog, divorceonplanetearth.com. If you have an idea for us for a future podcast, please write us at info@divorceonplanetearth.com. We hope that what you hear on this show will be helpful, but since everyone's situation is different, our content is not intended as a substitute for clinical advice or recommendations. I'm your co-host, Jane Prelinger. Your host has been Kate Scharf. Our producer is Eric Piguero. See you next time.